Hi Minerva makers, my name is Melanie and welcome to another Minerva sew-along. Today we'll be learning how to make a gorgeous wrap coat in a beautiful wool fabric. We'll be making this coat out of Simplicity 8990. This wrap coat pattern is suitable for people learning to sew coats. It's relatively simple to make because it doesn't have buttons, zippers, lining or complex pockets. That being said, the design is interesting and it has huge pocket space. The inside of the coat is also beautifully decorated with bias binding. This is a fun coat to wear in autumn and winter and will protect you from all kinds of elements. In this sew-along, we'll be learning how to use bias binding, how to top stitch, sew in sleeves, and the awesome pockets. I hope you'll give this project a try and let's get started. Today we'll be sewing Simplicity S8990 in View B. This is a long wrap coat with huge lapels which look like a cape. Here's all the materials that you'll need to make this coat. You'll need a copy of Simplicity 8990. This pattern comes in two size groups, 6 to 14 and 16 to 24. The back of the pattern has the body measurements for the size, suggested fabric, quantities and notions. I'll be cutting out this pattern in size 14. You'll need at least 3 meters of a coating fabric. The amount of fabric depends on your size and the width of your fabric. I'll be sewing this coat in a pure wool coating in a vibrant mustard color. The color is so intense and beautiful. The wool feels really soft and is beautiful from both sides, which is essential as this coat isn't lined. Minerva stocks this coating fabric in a wide range of colors to suit any wardrobe. I intend on dry cleaning this coat in the future, so I'm going to pre-shrink the fabric by steaming it with my iron. I've put the iron on the cotton steam settings and I'm hovering it just about 2 centimeters above the surface. To bind the seams on the inside of the coat, you need a packet of 1.3 centimeter wide single fold bias binding. You'll need a matching thread. I suggest buying at least 250 meters as this coat has a lot of seams. For the equipment, you'll need a sewing machine, pins and needles, a tape measure, tailor's chalk, fabric shears and paper scissors, a quick unpick, and for this type of fabric, you'll need to use heavy-duty needles in size 90/14. An iron and an ironing board. I'm also using a sleeve ironing board, but this is optional. The pattern, haberdasheries and fabric that you'll need for this project can be found on the Minerva website. I suggest signing up to the Minerva Craft Club. You'll receive an extra 10% off your order, which will really help towards buying quality equipment. To make View B, you'll need to cut out pieces 1 to 4 and 6 to 10. This pattern has multiple lines to represent each of the sizes. Take a highlighter or marker and trace around the line that represents your size. This will make it easier to cut. Cut around the outside of the pattern following the line for your size. You'll see that there's multiple cutting lines for pieces 1 and 3. View B has the shorter cutting length, but to preserve the pattern, I suggest cutting the longest cutting length for your size. When it comes to cutting out the pieces, you can simply fold the piece up along the View B cutting line. Note that for piece 1 that you'll need to attach the extension called piece 1A. Cut out both of these pieces in your size. Both of these pieces have circles with a cross in the middle, which is the match point. Place piece 1A on top of piece 1 and match it up. Use some sellotape to stick together these pieces and treat them as piece 1 from now on. We can go ahead and cut out the pattern pieces in our beautiful fabric. This pattern comes with cutting layouts that you'll need to follow to help you cut out all the pieces with minimal wastage. You'll see that there's 5 options to choose from for cutting View B. Choose the layout based on the size and width of your fabric. My fabric is about 150 centimeters wide and I'm making size 14, so I'll be using layout 2E. Note that the pieces that are shaded needs to be placed upside down when they are cut. The first box shows that piece 10 needs to be cut on a single layer of fabric. I'm going to lay out my fabric on the table. Grab piece 10 and place it near the end of the fabric. All pieces except piece 3 have grain line arrows. This arrow must be parallel with the selvage so that the piece will be cut on the grain and will drape properly. Use your tape measure to make sure that the length between the arrow and the selvage is the same at both ends of the arrow. Pin the entire piece in place. Grab your shears, cut around to the outside of the pattern piece. The triangle markings on the outside of the pattern piece are called notches and are essential to help us line up pattern pieces, so I'm going to carefully cut a small triangle into the fabric to mark the notch. Move over to the other end of the selvage. Place piece 10 upside down at the other end. Align it with the selvage and pin. Cut this piece out just the same. The next layout shows that the selvages of the fabric needs to be brought together. So in other words, I need to fold the fabric in half widthwise. I'm folding the fabric so that the wrong side of the fabric is facing out. Pin the selvages together. Next to the selvage, I'm going to place piece 4. Align this piece of the selvage and pin. Grab piece 7. This piece is cut diagonally or on the bias, so it's a little harder to cut. Place this piece next to piece 4 and close to the fold. Align the grain line and pin. Cut pieces 4 and 7 out. Next we'll cut piece 3 on the fold. This piece has a rectangle arrow marking on one of the edges, which indicates that this side needs to be cut on the fold. Place this side directly on top of the fold of the fabric and pin to make a full piece. Do not cut on the fold. Pin the rest of this piece. Notice that I've placed the end of this piece just below the cutting line for view B. I'm going to fold up the pattern along this cutting line and pin. When we cut this out, it will be the right length for the design. Next to piece 3, we'll cut piece 9. Align this piece with the fold and pin. On the leftover space next to the selvage, I'm going to pin piece 2. Go ahead and cut these pieces out. Next to the selvage, I'm going to place piece 1. Align this big piece with the selvage and pin. This piece also has a higher cutting line for view B, so I'm going to fold up the cutting line and pin. I'm going to place piece 6 next to 1, close to the fold. I'm lining up the grain line with the fold. Fold up to the cutting line for view B. Lastly, we need to cut piece 8. Align this piece with the fold and pin. You only need to cut out one copy of this piece, so I'm just pinning this piece through one layer of fabric. Now cut these pieces out. I'm only cutting out one layer of fabric for piece 8. We've cut all the pieces out, so let's prepare to sew. Before we start sewing, we need to mark in all the circle markings on piece 1, 3, 4, 6 and 10. For all of these pieces, I have the right size together. I'm going to place the pattern piece on top and pin close to the marking. Push your pin straight down through the circle. Remove all the pins so that you can pull up the pattern on one side. Use some tailor's chalk to make a dot marking at the base of the pin. Piece 1 has a marking to help line up the neckline and shoulders. The dot markings at the armhole help position the sleeves. The two highest markings on the side seam are to position the belt loops. The larger markings help leave an opening for the pockets. The markings on the front edge and bottom corner help line up the band which is used for the hem. Piece 3 has all the same markings as piece 1 for the shoulders, armhole and belt loops. The markings on piece 4 are to help ease in the sleeves into the armhole. The 2 circle markings on piece 10 are used to help attach this piece to the coat. The first thing we're going to sew for this coat is the collar, which is piece 1. On the pattern for piece 1, you'll see that there's a stitching line and dot marking that we previously transferred. Pay close attention to the seam allowance of this corner. The straight edge is the shoulder seam and has a seam allowance of 1.5 centimeters. The curved side has a seam allowance of 1 centimeter. We need to stay stitch the corner to reinforce it. The stay stitching needs to be inside of the seam allowance on a single layer of fabric. So I'm going to sew at 1.3 centimeters on the straight edge and about 8 millimeters on the curved edge. When you get close to the dot marking, push the needle into the fabric, lift the foot, and rotate the fabric. Sew close to the circle marking. Repeat for the other copy of piece 1. Grab your shears. Cut a slit into the fabric up to the stay stitching but not through it. Next we'll sew the centre back of the collar, which is the straight edge at the top of piece 1. We'll be sewing a flat felled seam on the right side to make a neat finish. Bring the wrong sides together for the collar and pin. Sew together at 1.5 centimeters seam allowance. The seam allowance on the bottom needs to be trimmed to a minimum so that we can remove the bulk. Carefully cut it off so that there's only about 5 millimeters remaining. Take the coat up to the ironing board. As this is a pure wool coat, you need to be careful how you iron it. If you use a hot iron on this delicate fibre, it will become flattened and shiny. Change your iron to the wool setting and on the steam function. Make sure you have water in the tank. It's best to iron the wool with a wool pressing cloth. So I've cut a piece of leftover fabric at about the same length as the iron plate. For this seam that we just made, we need to iron the seam allowance towards the right. Push the seam allowance towards the right side and place the pressing cloth on top. Press down with your iron. Now grab the long seam allowance and fold the raw edge under the trimmed one. Pin into place and make as even as possible. Sew on top of the fold that you just made to make a clean flat felled seam. Grab piece 3. We can sew the shoulder seams now. Place piece 1 on top so that the straight edges are together. Match the notches. You also need to match the dot marking at the neckline. You can do this by pushing a pin through both layers. Pin the shoulders into place. We need to sew from the dot marking to the other end of the shoulders. Use a seam allowance of 1.5 centimeters. Repeat for the other shoulder seam. Bring the coat back to the iron. Press the shoulder seam split. Grab your bias binding. Fold the bias binding in half lengthwise and press with your iron. Do this for about 3/4 of your pack of bias binding. We're going to bind the raw edges of the shoulder seam with this bias binding. Grab the double folded bias binding. You need to sandwich the raw edge of the fabric inside of the binding so it's completely covered and pin into place. Once you've covered all raw edges, you can cut off the bias binding. Do this for all of the raw edges. Sew on top of the binding near the edge. This creates a nice contrast to cover the raw edge. Next, we'll be sewing the neckline. Bring together the curved edges of 1 and 3. At the sewing machine, we need to sew from the dot marking to dot marking at 1.5 centimeters seam allowance. Grab your bias binding. This time we're going to do the understitching method for sewing the bias binding. For this method, you need to use the single fold binding. You need to unfold one of the raw edges. The fold needs to be placed on top of the seam that you just made for the neckline. At each end of the binding, I'm going to leave an excess of about 1/2 centimetre so I can fold it over later. I'm pinning the binding from the corner of the seam allowance across the neckline. When you reach the other end, cut off another excess of 1/2 centimetre. Trim down the seam allowance of the neckline to about 5 millimeters. Be very careful not to cut this bias binding. At your ironing board, iron the neckline seam allowance away from the collar. Remember the excess binding that we left at the end? Now I'm going to fold it back so that it's flush with the corner and press into place. Do this for both ends. Now you can go ahead and fold the unsewn end of the bias binding over the top of the neckline raw edge. You need to place the fold of the binding directly on top of the neckline seam. Press with your iron and pin into place. Back at your sewing machine, we need to sew on top of the fold of the bias binding. The neckline is now fully bound and looks really neat. Now we can sew the nice big pockets of this coat. Grab some double fold bias binding. Sandwich the curved raw edge of the pocket inside of the binding. Pin into place. Cut the end of the bias binding to be flush with the pocket. Do this for both of the pockets. Sew on top of the binding close to the edge. The bottom of the pocket has a sharply curved edge. Take your time sewing this. Make a few stitches, then push the needle into the fabric. Lift the foot and adjust the direction that you're sewing. Sew the binding to both pockets. Lay the back of your coat on your table with the right side facing up. On the side which you'll see a notch, the matching notch is on the pocket piece. Place the pocket on top of the back piece so that the right sides are together. Pin into place. On the other side seam you can pin the other pocket. Sew the pockets to the coat with a 1 cm seam allowance. With your iron, press the seam allowance towards the pocket. Do this for both of them. Lay the back piece on top of the table with the right side facing up and the pockets facing outwards. When we sew this next side seam, we need to leave an opening for the pocket. On the pattern, this opening is between the small circle markings on piece 1 and 3. I'm going to make a line between these markings to make it easier to see. You can now fold back the front pieces over the top of the back piece. Place the right sides together at the side seams. Match the notch. Pin around the markings for the opening. Start sewing at the corner for the armhole at 1.5 cm seam allowance. Stop sewing on top of the circle marking. Restart sewing on the other circle marking and sew down to the bottom of the coat. Make sure that you don't catch the pocket in this seam. Iron the side seam split. Flip the pocket piece aside so you can see the opening. I'm going to make a mark at the bottom and top of the opening so it's easier to see. I'm going to make a slit halfway into the seam allowance just below and above the opening. We need to hem the opening to make sure it's a neat edge. I'm going to fold under about half of the seam allowance and pin. Bring your coat up to the sewing machine. To make a nice hem, I'm going to start sewing from the end of the opening out to the fold. I'm then going to turn and sew over the fold. This is a little less than 1 cm seam allowance. Sew until you reach the other end of the opening. Make a 90-degree turn to sew right up to the other end of the opening. If you've done this right, you should make a nice rectangle top stitch on the opening. Grab some bias binding. We need to apply the double fold bias binding to the raw edge of the side seam, pin the bias binding to one side of the seam and cut to the length. Sew on top of the bias binding. With your iron, you now need to iron the pocket piece towards the front of the coat. Make sure that the opening for the pocket is flush with the side seam and that the coat is completely flat. Pin around the curved side of the pocket. We need to sew from the side seam all the way around the curved pocket to the other side seam. Sew at 1.5 cm seam allowance. Sew the curved area slowly. Make a few stitches, push the needle into the fabric, then adjust your direction to make a smooth curve. On the right side of the coat, you'll have a beautiful top stitch outline of the pocket which starts at the side seam. The pocket is functional and looks great. Next, we'll sew the belt loops. This is made from piece 8. With your iron, fold piece 8 in half with the right sides together and press. Unfold this piece. Take the long raw edge and fold it so that the raw edge is on the center and press. Do this for the other raw edge as well. Sew close to the fold on the long side of the loop. Fold the loop in half and cut. You should have 2 belt loops. The belt loop is attached to the coat at the side seam. Each end of the loop must be on top of the big circle marking on piece 1. I previously transferred these markings onto the wrong side of the fabric, so I'm going to stick a pin through the marking. On the right side of the fabric, I'm going to make a marking with tailor's chalk. Fold about 1 cm of the loop under at each end. Apply the loop to the marking and pin. Pin the loops so that they're a little loose. Bring the belt loop up to the sewing machine. Sew on top of the loop going backwards and forwards several times. Personally, I recommend hand sewing the loops as the fabric is so thick that my sewing machine can barely handle it. Next we'll sew the sleeves, which is made from piece 4. This piece has 3 circle markings at the head which we previously marked. We need to sew an easing stitch on top of these markings to help ease the sleeve into the armhole. Change your thread to a contrasting colour if you have it. Increase your stitch length to the maximum on the straight stitch. Pull some thread out of the machine before and after you sew. To make the easing stitch, we need to sew at 1 cm and 2 cm seam allowance on top of the chalk markings. Do not backstitch before or after you sew and leave long tails of threads at each end. Change your thread back to a matching colour and use a normal stitch length. Now we'll go ahead and sew the side seam for the sleeve. Bring the right sides together and match up the side seam for the sleeve. Pin together. Sew the sleeve at 1.5 centimeters seam allowance. I'm going to use my sleeve ironing board to press the side seam. Slide the sleeve in and press the seam allowance split apart. To the bottom edge of the sleeve, I'm going to apply double fold bias binding. Place the end of the bias binding with a little excess over the top of the side seam. Pin the bias binding over the raw edge. When you've made a full circle, cut the bias binding so that it's about 0.5 centimeter excess from the side seam. At the end of the bias binding, fold the excess away on the inside. Pin this fold on top of the side seam to make a neat look. Take off the attachment on your machine while you're sewing the next few steps of the sleeves. Slide the sleeve into the machine. Sew on top of the bias binding. Bring the sleeve over to your ironing board with the right side facing out. Fold up the bound edge of the sleeve by 3.2 centimeters on the wrong side. Use your iron to press the fold. Pin into place. Sew on top of the edge of the bias binding. Do this for both sleeves. On the right side, the sleeve is nicely hemmed and the inside has a neat band of bias binding. Turn the sleeve the right side out. The next step is to sew the sleeve into the armhole. Take one strand from each of the easing stitches from one end. Gently pull the threads and use your other hand to hold the fabric. The fabric will tense up and gather under your fingers. You'll need to gather the outside more heavily than on the inside. Do this for both sleeves. You'll be done when the raw edge looks a little wavy. Place the coat on the table with the inside out. Place the sleeve inside of the coat with the right sides together. Check that the notches match. You will also need to match up the sleeve seam with the side seam. Pin the entire sleeve and armhole together. Adjust the gathers further to ease in the sleeve. The 3 circle markings on the sleeve have a matching marking on the armhole. The middle circle lines up with the shoulder seam. To match them up, you can push the needle through one marking and out through the other. Pin the entire sleeve. Slide the sleeve into the sewing machine. Sew from the side seam all the way around the armhole. Sew this seam again at about 1.2 centimeters seam allowance to reinforce the seam. Repeat for the other armhole. Trim off as much seam allowance as possible. Unpick the easing stitch from the sleeves. Just like with the sleeve raw edge, wrap the bias binding around the armhole raw edge. Pin into place. Fold the end of the bias binding over the seam. Sew on top of the bias binding. The sleeves are all done. Next, we need to prepare to hem the coat. This coat is hemmed with a decorative band. Grab pieces 6 and 7. We'll be sewing these two pieces together at the side seam, which is the side with the notch. Match these pieces together and pin both copies. Sew these pieces together at 1.5 cm seam allowance. The next piece that needs to be sewn is piece 10 to 6. Now the next seam can be a little confusing as the instructions refer to a marking which isn't there. The ends that need to be attached have a diagonal edge. At the short corner you need to mark in the seam allowance at 1.5 cm with some tailor's chalk. We need to sew from this corner down to the short edge, leaving the long end open. Pin piece 10 to 6 with the right sides together. Sew together at 1.5 cm seam allowance. You'll now have 2 sets of bands. Grab the ends, which are piece 7. Pin both pieces together at the centre back. The last 2 edges will be piece 10. Pin right sides together at the centre back. Sew both of these seams at 1.5 cm seam allowance. You should have a nice loop which you can apply to the outside of your coat. Iron all of the band seams split. We need to fold away the seam allowance for the inner edge of the band. Start at the corner and fold back the raw edge by 1.5 cm with your measuring tape. Use an iron to press, then pin. Work your way all the way around the band. Lay the coat on the table with the right side facing up. The seam for piece 6 and 10 needs to be placed at the bottom corner of the coat. Place right sides together and pin. Place the circle marking on piece 10 on the bottom side seam for the coat. Pin the other corner as well. Work up the side of the coat. The seam for piece 6 and 7 needs to be placed on top of the circle marking on piece 1. Pin together at the top centre back seam for the coat and band. Sew the band to the coat at 1.5 cm seam allowance. We need to reinforce this seam at the corner and top curved edge. Sew again at 1.3 cm seam allowance. Cut off the seam allowance diagonally at the corners to remove excess bolt. Try not to cut through the reinforcing seam. This will create a smooth corner. Trim the seam allowance to about half. At the curved end of the coat, cut triangles into the seam allowance up to the reinforcing seam. Bring the coat up to the ironing board. Flip the bands outwards towards the wrong side of the coat and take out all the pins on the fold. Use your iron to press the fold. Pin into place. Make sure that the outside of the coat is flat and that you can't see the raw edge on the inside. Sew on top of the edge with a 1 cm seam allowance. Do this for the entire edge of the coat. Pin the inner fold of the coat. Make sure that none of the raw edge is showing. Now we'll sew 1 cm from the fold on the other side of the band. This creates 2 neat rows of stitches. It looks really neat and elegant from the right side and the wrong side. The last thing we need to do for this coat is to sew the belt. The belt is made from piece 9. Place both copies of piece 9 right sides together and pin at the short side with the notch. Sew together at 1.5 centimeters seam allowance. Press with your iron. For this next part, I'm going to make 2 markings about 15 centimeters apart. We'll use this as a reminder to leave an opening for the next seam. Fold the belt in half lengthwise so that the right side's together. Try to match up the seam for the center of the belt. Pin the raw edges together but leave the space between the chalk markings unpinned. Sew the raw edges of the belt at 1.5 centimeters. Stop sewing at the markings for the opening. Sew again at 1.3 centimeters seam allowance around the corner. This is the reinforcing seam. You can now cut diagonally around the corners to remove all the seam allowance. Trim the seam allowance to about half. Pull the belt the right side out. Take the belt over to the iron and press out the seam. Pin the opening so the raw edges are tucked on the inside and the belt is straight. Grab a needle and thread it with a double strand of thread, not one of the ends. We need to slip stitch the opening of the belt. Push the needle through the wrong side of the belt near the end of the opening and pull through. On the other side, run the needle through the fold for about 0.5 centimeter and pull through. Make the next stitch on the other side. Push the needle into the fold opposite where the last stitch ended for about 0.5 centimeter and pull through. Keep repeating this pattern of stitches for the length of the opening. Here's how to make a knot. Make a small stitch and pull down to a loop. Pass the needle through the loop 3 times. Pull the needle and a knot will form at the base. Repeat once. And cut off. For the last step of sewing the belt, we need to top stitch it. Sew on top of the edge of the belt with a 1 centimeter seam allowance. And the coat is all done. I love the top stitching details around the edges and the pockets. It's really beautiful inside and out. This coat is something that you can keep in your wardrobe for seasons to come and will never go out of style. Thanks for joining me in this Minerva sew-along. Today we learnt many of the techniques that are required for coat making, and we learned how to make a beautiful wrap coat. I hope you'll give this pattern a try for yourself. Feel free to post your creation to the Minerva website. We'd love to see what you make and how you interpret the pattern. Please follow Minerva for more projects, inspirations, and sewing tutorials. Thanks for watching!